Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov declared that the Kremlin will deploy troops in Cuba and Venezuela in case that talks with the West on European security and Ukraine fail to go its way. When asked about these remarks, Ryabkov said that it all depends on the actions by our US counterparts. These declarations represented a massive controversy in Latin America, considering that this is nothing more than some kind of Cold War move that confirms Moscow's influence not only in Cuba but also in Venezuela. Since the Soviet Union still existed, it was known by everybody that Cuba was somehow a satellite of the Kremlin here in this region, here in Latin America. This influence from the Kremlin on Havana remains since the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the eventual rise of Vladimir Putin. Of course, this situation also took place in Venezuela since the rise of former dictator Hugo Chavez, who decided to turn one of the most stable democracies in South America in one of the worst tyrannies and dictatorships. Of course, in order to make this happen, he knew that he needed to be aligned with different allies, with different countries, with different superpowers around the world. And he, of course, chose Russia as the main one. So, getting to this point, it remains unclear how the Biden administration will somehow respond in case that Russia decides essentially to deploy troops in Cuba and in Venezuela, which we're talking about countries that are extremely close to the US, that are extremely close to Miami and Florida. Of course, this will also put into question the so-called Monroe Doctrine, which essentially represented the way that the US was the superpower, is the superpower in this region, and this region essentially belongs to the US, which basically means that there can't be any European or any country from other region that somehow invades these countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. So it is important to take into consideration that on this point, to this day, neither the Cuban or the Venezuelan regime have made any kind of comment about Ryabkov remarks, which of course is actually quite ironic if we take into consideration that both Cuba and Venezuela have been claiming over the last few decades that they are fighting against imperialism, that imperialism is essentially the biggest threat of humanity, and of course that they wouldn't accept any type of imperialist move or imperialist actions. This is quite ironic because we need to take into consideration that this thing about Russia, these intentions of Moscow of deploying troops both in Venezuela and Cuba, is essentially the clearest imperialist move, and none of these regimes have made any comments about it. Naturally, this doesn't represent any kind of surprise if we take into consideration that every single left-wing dictatorship have been behaving this way, not only on their actions but also on their discourse, on their narrative. This situation is quite delicate because we need to remember that this comes at a moment when Russia essentially deployed troops in Kazakhstan in order to thwart, in order to end with the widespread protests that were putting at risk the instability of the pro-Russian government in Kazakhstan. And on the other hand, this situation comes in a moment where many political analysts believe that a war between Russia and Ukraine is essentially a couple of hours, that the possibility that Vladimir Putin decides to invade Ukraine is almost inevitable. So we see what is going to happen. Of course, it is actually not that possible. It's not that possible that Russia deploys these troops. If you want my opinion on this matter, I don't see this. I don't see this situation, this scenario, as extremely possible, because this will represent a lot of problems with Russia, considering that Cuba and Venezuela are not exactly Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Cuba and Venezuela are extremely far from Russia, and this will only represent a biggest waste of money from a country that is not currently on its best economic reality. Reporting from Medellin, Colombia, Luis Orozco, Newsweek.